What do the comedian Bob Hope, the director Frank Capra, bodybuilder Charles Atlas, songwriter Irving Berlin, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, football coach Knute Rockne, and movie producer Samuel Goldwyn all have in common? They all arrived at Ellis Island as immigrants, and the first recognizable thing in America they saw was the Statue of Liberty. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody is free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, good listeners. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode number 2. We are coming to you this week from the delightful Credit Mobilier Studios, located somewhere outside of Boston, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook and Twitter, where I tweet as In the Past Lane. Keeping us focused and at the top of our game is the one and only Lulu Spencer, our executive producer. So what's up this week at In the Past Lane? Well, this week, we're talking immigration history. You know, immigration. You might have heard it mentioned lately. Maybe in the news or during one of the presidential debates. Yeah. First, we'll start with a think piece that explores a little-known aspect of American immigration history. It's the fascinating story of the Statue of Liberty. Today, it's an icon of American immigration history. But originally, it had nothing to do with immigration. Nothing at all. Next, we'll turn to historian Vincent Cannato to get his take on why immigration is now, and seemingly always has been, a hot political issue. Next in this episode, we shift to the History Skinny. This is the segment where I'm joined by In the Past Lane senior correspondent Stephanie Yule to talk about how history has made headlines this week. And by headlines, we're talking both kinds of headlines. The ones that bring a smile to your face, and others that make you want to throw yourself off a bridge into a raging river. In our final segment, it's time for Mercy Street Rewind. That's the feature where I bring in the Past Lane's senior historical correspondent, Megan Kate Nelson, to get her insightful analysis and commentary on the latest episode of the PBS historical drama, Mercy Street. But since we want to avoid dropping any spoilers on those of you who haven't yet watched the show, our Mercy Street Rewind feature will appear as a separate segment in this podcast feed. Okay, people, click those seatbelts. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. In the Past Lane is brought to you by the United States Treasury, maker of the currency that brings you images of dead presidents and other luminaries of American history since 1862. The U.S. Treasury. We put history in your wallet. Immigration. These days, everyone's talking about it, especially the presidential candidates. And when they do, have you ever noticed that the news coverage is always accompanied by an image of the Statue of Liberty? I mean, it's clearly our iconic image when it comes to immigration. For example, a couple weeks ago when Donald Trump called for a ban on Muslim immigration to the U.S., the New York Daily News put a political cartoon on its front page, and it showed Trump dressed up as a jihadi militant lopping the head of the Statue of Liberty off with a sword. Just this past week, Democratic presidential hopeful Martin O'Malley, arguing in favor of accepting immigrants from the Middle East, said, quote, "The enduring symbol of our country is not the barbed wire fence. It is the Statue of Liberty."
Now, this might seem logical, since nearly everybody associates the Statue of Liberty with immigration. But here's the kicker. The Statue of Liberty originally had nothing to do with immigration. Nothing at all. Nada. Shocking? Well, think about it. France gave the United States the Statue of Liberty way back in the 1870s. Why would France give us a colossal statue to welcome immigrants? Okay, so you're probably puzzling over two questions at this point. Number one, if the statue had nothing to do with immigration, what did it originally stand for? And number two, how and when did the statue become a symbol of immigration? Well, let's start with this first question. What did the Statue of Liberty stand for when it was unveiled in 1886? In a word, it celebrated the birth of the American Republic, and it proclaimed the hope that one day all nations of the world would become republics. The guy who came up with this idea was Edward René de la Boulaye. He was a French legal scholar, political leader, and reformer. But why would a Frenchman propose such a project? First, he greatly admired the United States, and he hoped the monument would strengthen Franco-American ties. Secondly, he hoped the celebration of Republican ideals would have an impact on the political scene in France. See, at the time, Napoleon III was basically crushing Republican liberties. So La Boulaye hoped that this celebration of Republican liberty would have a ripple effect, if you will, sort of inspiring Republican reformers in France to push back against Napoleon III. So he basically saw the Statue of Liberty as a two-for-one. It would honor America, and it would hopefully inspire a revival of republicanism in his home country of France. Now all La Boulaye had to do was build it. He began raising funds and making plans for the statue. To design it, he hired the sculptor Frederick Bartholdi. And we should stop here for a moment to talk about a fascinating and little-known fact about the original inspiration for Lady Liberty. Years before starting work on the Statue of Liberty, Bartholdi was in Egypt, and he was there to draw up plans for a massive statue of an Egyptian Muslim peasant woman. And this was going to stand at one end of the newly completed Suez Canal. He called it Egypt Carrying Light to Asia. Well, eventually, Egyptian officials rejected the plan. It was just too ostentatious, and they went instead with a more practical lighthouse. But Bartholdi, he saved the drawings, and he later basically just repurposed them to come up with the Statue of Liberty. So people, stop and think about this. This means that America's Lady Liberty was originally a veiled Muslim woman. Isn't history fascinating? Full of surprises? Indeed. Okay, fast forward to 1886, and the statue is nearing completion on a small island in New York Harbor. Now, by this time, Americans all across the country, they know what the Statue of Liberty looks like. I mean, they've seen countless drawings of it in newspapers and magazines. And they knew what it stood for, that it was all about celebrating Republican ideals. Hardly anyone thought of it as a symbol of immigration. After all, its official name was Liberty Enlightening the World. And its symbolism, man, it practically shouted republicanism. Lady Liberty carries in her right hand the Torch of Liberty, and in her left hand she holds a tablet inscribed with July 4th, 1776, the birthday of the American Republic. Moreover, she faces the Atlantic Ocean and Europe, not the United States, and her message is clear. Hey, Europe and the rest of the world, you want some of this American peace, prosperity, and progress? Well then, get rid of your kings and queens, your aristocracies, establish churches and fixed classes, and embrace Republican government. Now that was the central message at the gigantic celebration that attended the statue's unveiling on October 28, 1886. The editors of the New York Times set the tone, writing, quote, "On our shores has been realized with all its imperfections the most successful and hopeful of all the social systems that have grown up in the history of mankind." President Grover Cleveland agreed, and he declared in his speech, quote, "We will not forget that Lady Liberty has here made her home." Now, there was one reference to immigration in this big celebration, but it was a negative one, and it came from railroad magnate Chauncey Depew. In his speech, he referenced the widespread social unrest then rocking the nation, and we should note here that 1886 was a year marked by a record number of strikes. Chauncey Depew declared that these problems would be solved by adhering to the Republican ideals represented by the statue. He said, quote, "The problems of labor and capital, of property and poverty, will work themselves out under the benign influence of enlightened lawmaking and law-abiding liberty, without the aid of kings and armies, or of anarchists and bombs." Well, this last reference to anarchists and bombs pointed to a widespread fear that the strikes and social unrest that were then rocking the nation had been stirred up by radical immigrants who brought un-American ideas like socialism, communism, and anarchism to the United States. Now, some of you may be wondering at this point, if the Statue of Liberty originated without any consideration of immigration, then what about the poem? You know, the one that's so closely associated with it. You know the poem, part of which goes, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." This poem, The New Colossus, was written in 1883 by a Jewish-American poet named Emma Lazarus. It clearly celebrates the statue as a beacon of hope to immigrants seeking freedom. So we can clearly see that Lazarus, well, she's way ahead of her time. But she was essentially all alone in this view. The historical record shows that few, if any, Americans saw the Statue of Liberty in this light. No one paid any attention to Lazarus's poem when it was first published in 1883. 3 years later, no one mentioned the poem at the big celebration unveiling the statue. None of Lazarus's obituaries mentioned the poem when she died in 1887. Even when a wealthy friend of hers in 1903 had the poem inscribed on a bronze tablet and then had the tablet attached to the base of the statue, it drew almost no attention at all. As late as the 1930s, the National Park Service, that's the government agency that managed the statue, told visitors that Lady Liberty was a symbol of Franco-American unity and Republican liberty. Of course, that was the official interpretation. Millions of immigrants who entered New York Harbor after the Statue of Liberty was unveiled in 1886 saw it the same way Emma Lazarus did. They interpreted the statue as a beacon of hope and a symbol of freedom from Old World oppression. But native-born Americans in the late 19th century harbored no such warm and fuzzy feelings. Most Americans at this time looked at the huddled masses as a dire threat to American society, not the building blocks of a vibrant and prosperous multi-ethnic democracy. Now, we can literally see this anti-immigrant sentiment in the way political cartoonists used the image of the Statue of Liberty. More often than not, they used it to condemn immigration, and you can see many examples of these cartoons at our website. But I do want to draw attention to one of them. It's titled Dumping European Garbage, and it's a vivid cartoon that shows the statue with a look of horror on her face, and she's hiking up her robes as a ship labeled European Garbage dumps filthy immigrants at her feet. Well, this surging anti-immigrant sentiment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it eventually resulted in severe restrictions on immigration in 1924. And here's where we come to the answer to our second question, which was, when did the Statue of Liberty become a positive symbol of America's immigrant tradition? Well, tellingly, it wasn't until after Congress sharply restricted immigration in 1924. That's when Americans began to assign this new meaning to the statue, that of a goddess of liberty welcoming the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And yes, that's when the poem, Emma Lazarus's poem, written 50 years earlier, finally became widely known. While this delayed transformation might seem strange, history tells us that it's actually quite common. Societies often begin honoring something only after it's gone. For example, white Americans despised Native Americans for most of our history, until they were defeated and confined to reservations in the 1880s. Then white Americans began to embrace a romanticized image of Native Americans that remains very powerful to this very day. And so it was with the Statue of Liberty. Once immigration was sharply curtailed and people's fears of immigration diminished, it became safe to develop a happy and noble immigration narrative. To explain how this happened in the case of the Statue of Liberty, let's listen to what historian John Hyam wrote in an essay titled The Transformation of the Statue of Liberty. He wrote, quote, "So long as millions of immigrants entered the Golden Door, the Statue of Liberty was unresponsive to them. It served other purposes. After the ships no longer passed under the new Colossus in significant numbers, the Statue of Liberty enshrined the immigrant experience as a transcendental national memory. Because few Americans were now immigrants, all could think of them as having been immigrants." In other words, once immigration had been almost completely stopped, once fewer Americans were immigrants and more were the children and grandchildren of immigrants, American society basically begins to get nostalgic about its immigrant past. In the 1950s, a museum of immigration was opened at the statue, and huge crowds arrived to tour it. Gradually, the Statue of Liberty, wrote John Hyam, quote, "joined the covered wagon as a symbol of the migrations that had made America." Decades later, in the 1970s and 1980s, this nostalgia for immigration inspired two huge projects that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. the restoration of both the Statue of Liberty and nearby Ellis Island, and on the latter, of course, the building of a huge National Museum of Immigration. Today, both landmarks receive millions of visitors, and these people come not to learn about Franco-American unity or Republican ideals. Rather, they come to experience America's immigration history. And while this is largely a good thing, I mean, we certainly want people going to museums and learning about history, there is a pernicious aspect to it that we need to acknowledge. In essence, many Americans today use this happy memory of a seemingly heroic chapter of American immigration history as a way to condemn contemporary immigration as somehow just not measuring up. Well, we will take up that hot potato topic in a future podcast. All of this should remind us that history is not just about the past. Our notions of history have an enormous impact on the way we understand our present. So our notions of immigration clearly have a big impact on the way we understand immigration as it's happening right now. Stay tuned, people. We'll be right back.
You're listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then please subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Subscribing is free, and once you do it, new episodes of In the Past Lane are automatically downloaded to your listening device. Subscribing also gives you access to the entire back catalog of In the Past Lane episodes. And if you do subscribe, please leave a review. Thanks.
With us now on In the Past Lane is historian Vincent Cannato. Vincent is a historian at the University of Massachusetts, and he's written widely on this topic of immigration, including the most recent book, American Passage, A History of Ellis Island. Thanks for being with us, Vince.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
All right, great. Well, why is it that immigration has always, or very often been, in almost every era of American history, a key kind of hot-button political issue? And what does that say about the way we think about immigration historically as people now in the 21st century?
Well, I think it's always about defining who is American and what is America. The idea of America is an idea that's always being developed and evolving and changing, unlike, let's say, the French or the German, which much of it is based on blood, history, past, ethnicity. What is an American is much more of an idea. It's a concept, and it changes over time. So when we debate immigration, we're really debating who we are as a people, what we want to be going forward, who we want to be as a future. So that's why these debates keep cropping up every so often. This is a continual debate on the nature of American society and American identity.
Yeah, and I think partly also it's that immigration has continued to be an issue because we've all basically, with some exceptions, always had immigration, at least on some level. So
yeah, even during the quota years where, we talk about restrictions, you've still got a couple 100,000 immigrants coming in during that time. So for the previous 200 years, at least immigration has been a constant in American history.
Right. And it seems like it's in some ways, if you want to take a kind of a cynical look, for politicians, it's kind of an easy go-to stir up the people kind of an image, because it's always, much as we revere immigration, millions of people go to the Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty and go to places like the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. They do genealogy. So as I always tell students and groups that I talk to, Americans love immigration, and that sort of raises people's eyebrows. I say, oh, no, they love immigration. They're just not so keen on immigration in the present moment, whether that present moment is 1905, 1805, or 2016.
I always think it's even more complicated than that. I always like to say that the American psyche, the American mind, is forever split. So it's not just in the past, it's also today. And even people who are quote unquote anti-immigrant will also say very positive things about immigration, not just in the past, but the present. They'll talk about the importance of immigration to America. They'll praise hardworking immigrants, while also saying we need to stop Muslim immigrants, or immigrants are taking jobs, or so forth. It's a kind of a weird dichotomy. Even going back in history, it's very rare to find people who will say no immigration at all, ever.
Right. I think people have long made those distinctions of good immigrants and bad immigrants. And that seems to be a constant
I mean, the closest you'd get is, recent, Pat Buchanan, I think, floated the issue a few years ago, a moratorium on immigration. Let's stop for a year or two and see what happens. But that's really as far as people would go, because I think most Americans will say we like immigration, that immigration is part of who we are as American. The debate is over what kinds of immigrants, how many immigrants. That's really where the tensions and the controversy lie.
And I think in contemporary times, the newer wrinkle between not just good immigrants and bad immigrants, but the emergence of the issue of undocumented or illegal immigrants. That's a relatively recent phenomenon. And so that allows people to make that distinction as well.
Exactly.
So I'm not anti-immigrant, I'm anti-illegal immigrant. And that's where their thinking lies. And even though the reality is a lot more complicated, that's a sort of a simple sorting mechanism, I think, that people use.
Exactly. And that's, most of the heat on the immigration issue for the last 20 years has been on that topic. And you could argue maybe that's a substitute for deeper problems with legal immigration, but it certainly is the focal point. And it's been something that, there's always been illegal immigration, quote unquote. From the first time that there was an immigration law or an immigration policy, you had people who were going to circumvent it. But as a major issue, where we're talking about millions of people, this is a fairly new concept.
The other dimension, of course, is, and you hear this in some circles today especially, is the political connection, that immigrants have always been seen as potential voters by one party, seeing that as a good thing, and another party seeing this as a bad thing, if not a conspiracy, that one party is pro-immigration in order to fill their ranks and to get a lock on politics for the next generation.
Yeah, partisan politics plays a huge role. And I think it plays a huge role today as well. Although, in the past, immigration cut partisan-wise in different ways. Whereas today, what's very interesting is, to me, what's going on in the Democratic Party, because you have key aspects of the Democratic Party today that are traditionally, I won't say anti-immigrant, but let's say in favor of restriction. Those would be labor unions. Those would be environmental groups. Those would be African Americans. And in the last, I would say, 10 years, that's changed, right? And the Democratic Party is almost completely a party of, put your phrase in it, pro-immigrant, open borders, whatever you would like. And the Republican Party is a mix, right? You have pro-immigrant aspects, business interests, and then you have more restrictionist interests. And one of the arguments from Republicans is that Democrats are doing this to basically to push forward a Democratic majority, right, of Latinos and Asians and so forth. And there's a political aspect to it. So that adds to all the other anxiety that goes along with immigration.
And that is an echo of the mid-19th century, with the great arrival of particularly Irish immigrants who were overwhelmingly, once they became citizens, flocked to the Democratic Party and really created Democratic majorities in cities and in much of the North and Midwest. And that was a constant refrain among pro-restrictionists, that we are bringing in people that are basically doing this job of working for the Democratic Party.
Sure. the sort of myth/reality of the immigrant coming off the boat and getting signed up by Tammany Hall as soon as they're getting off the boat. This has been an important distinction, important issue among lots of people in talk about immigration and are concerned with immigration.
All right. Is there anything else you want to add in terms of the potency of this issue in modern times and with gestures towards the past?
I think the other thing that people don't realize, sometimes we get so caught up with what's going on in America that we don't realize this is an international thing. Concern about immigration is not an American phenomenon, even though it's a constant in American history. We're seeing it in Europe today, right? Finally, after a long time, Europeans are very, very concerned about the issue of immigration. Other countries, Mexico, Central America, these are countries that are very concerned about border keeping and about who comes into the country, who's allowed to be citizens. There's kind of a universal issue here. Xenophobia, fear of foreigners, is not a uniquely American disease. It's not a uniquely Western disease. It's a uniquely human disease. I think humans are kind of hardwired to be suspicious of the other, of foreigners, and to be less suspicious of those who are closer to us. And I think we forget about that. And it's not just simply an American issue. And
right.
Europe's dealing with it. And I tell people that, for whatever faults, and there are a lot of faults in our current system, immigration system, we are a much freer and more liberalized system than most countries in the world. That's not to say we have open borders. It's actually can be very difficult to get into the country.
Yeah, it's very difficult if you go through the legal channels.
Right. But if you think about, how to emigrate to Canada or Australia, which are also fairly open, those are places that put much more emphasis on how much money you have, on whether you can start a business. And
right.
So that's important to keep in mind.
It is. And I think the fact that immigration has become this sort of global, or the fact that it's come into the news is a bit of a shock to Americans who associate it as an American issue. And then you throw in the turmoil in the global economy, and historically, anti-immigrant sentiment or fear of immigration has always been tied to the ups and downs of the economy. And then you throw in emergence of global awareness of terrorism as also being somehow at least potentially tied to immigration. I think that really ramps up people's fears.
Yeah, economics, terrorism, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, would have been anarchism. Today it's Islamic terrorism. Yeah, you add all those together, I think you're exactly right, that really ramps up anxiety.
Yeah, I think people would be shocked to know that back in the 1880s, they were talking about terrorists coming to the United States, and these were Irish radicals and German anarchists. And then in the early 20th century, it was Southern and Eastern European anarchists who, in fact, did carry out acts of terrorism on American soil. This is a real shocker to a lot of people. They don't realize that one of the things about it, as we know as historians, is most things are not new. They're just they're taking new form in new times. And so the fear of immigration and terrorism is not a recent post 9/11 thing.
Right.
Well, Vin, thanks so much. This has been great, and appreciate you coming on and talking to us at In the Past Lane about immigration history, and I hope to do it again.
Thanks, Ed. Definitely.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Conservative critics are calling it revisionist history with an anti-American bias. So
Abraham Lincoln's 200th birthday was a marked celebration for Springfield, Illinois.
Commemorating the 74th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
This morning, the Confederate flag is no longer flying over Fort Sumter, South Carolina, where Southerners fired the first shots of the Civil War.
Well, it's time for the History Skinny, the segment where we take a look at how history has made headlines in recent days. Joining me today is In the Past Lane's senior correspondent, historian Stephanie Ewell. Thanks for being here, Stephanie.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Well, history made a lot of headlines this week, so let's get right to it. We can't cover them all, so Stephanie, what stood out for you?
Well, there were three stories in particular that stood out for me, and they're connected in some interesting ways. The first was this issue with Scholastic pulling the George Washington book that was called The Birthday Cake, which tells the story of Hercules, who was the first White House chef,
and a slave,
confronting a dilemma of having no sugar but needing to make the president a cake. And
this is a book aimed at really young children.
Yeah, grades 1 to 3. And the problem with the book, critics claimed, was that it didn't depict the context in which Hercules functioned, right? It depicted him as a happy, joyful man in the tradition of Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben.
Beaming, yeah, and very much, it's a highly illustrated book because it's for
young kids,
so
right?
He's smiling, he and his daughter Delia are smiling and almost
and all the relationships are positive.
Yeah.
And while it's certainly important to note that even if you are an enslaved individual, that doesn't mean you can't take pride in your work, right?
Or have moments of happiness.
Of course, yeah. And that's important about underscoring the human dignity, but in fact, this is such a partial truth, right? Because there's no sense of the larger context. There's no sense of Washington's treatment of slaves, which in fact he was known to be a rather harsh taskmaster.
And
also
he had several hundred of them. So Hercules is but one of them, and actually one of the more privileged ones.
Exactly. And also the fact that Hercules escaped. He ended up running away, stealing himself from this situation. So clearly not so happy.
Yeah, however happy he might have been in this story, he's not ultimately happy. And
exactly.
Seizes the opportunity to steal himself when it
away.
Presents itself.
So it's an interesting question as to why the editors or the authors didn't choose to tell that part of the story. In other words, it's an unfinished story. It's an unfinished, incomplete task. And I think that's interesting. It would have been cool to see what that would have looked like. I think it's because people have a hard time dealing with ambiguity and passing that on to kids, right? I have students say to me often, but don't we need heroes? When do you tell people that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves? Because he's such a hero in other ways. And I just think that if you don't deal with ambiguity early, get them young, right? Get them young, and then maybe they'll be a little more able to have this kind of both and view of the world. So
right. I mean, people have this fear of talking about the darker side of individuals or the darker chapters of American history. And I always say, if you really think history should be just about boosting patriotism, then you don't really want history. You want a photo album.
Exactly.
A family photo album if you leaf through it, you get one sort of slice of a family's life, which is all good. It's all Christmases and birthdays and graduations and great moments. But there's nothing in there about fights, about lying, about cheating, about drunkenness and car accidents, whatever the things that happen in every family.
It's the worst Christmas holiday letter you've ever received, exactly. Which is like a resume of achievements, right?
Yes.
The other thing
litany of glorious achievements.
Exactly. And I do want to mention, do you remember that movie? It was called It's a Beautiful Life with Roberto Benigni years ago.
About the Holocaust.
Exactly. And about a man and his child, both Jewish, who were in a concentration camp, and the father was comedic and tried to convince his child that this was a game as a survival mechanism. And people were very critical of that. How can you make light of the Holocaust? And the response was, well, we're not making light of the Holocaust, but in fact, this is a story of love between a father and a child, and to assert their human dignity, to say, you haven't obliterated me, you Nazi murderers, I can still experience some joy. But that's not the case in this book.
Right.
This book is really, it's a gloss. It's a glossing that makes slavery look like a pretty great setup.
Right,
So,
and I think they were relying on the positive depiction of Hercules, which is that he's a resourceful, creative,
Correct.
skilled individual, and that's enough. That's enough to sort of check the diversity box or check the sensitivity box.
Exactly.
And I think that's what people were mostly upset about. It's not necessarily an inaccurate book, but it's an incredibly incomplete book.
yeah, it's an incomplete book. But it does raise this interesting question. I mean, do we have children's books about Nat Turner? Denmark Vesey? Not really.
Not yet.
What would that look like? Or not yet, yeah. So
I think there are some young adult, sort of high school-ish
Yeah.
age books, but certainly nothing in the 7 to 10 range like
so
this one.
it's interesting. Be curious to see, what do psychologists think? When can kids start dealing with this kind of stuff? When can they actually process it? I think in my own parenting, we've done it from the beginning. They don't seem too screwed up, my children, so we'll see.
That's right. And the other thing is, of course, kids are dealing with violence and violent stories through film and through video games and things.
music.
So it's really not that.
Yeah.
All that wouldn't, for most kids, I don't think would be all that shocking.
And then it's probably, quite frankly, the parents' problem.
Right. That they're
Right.
just.
It's adults, not kids, as often is the case. Look at Harry Potter. It's rife with that kind of ambiguity
Yep.
of good and evil. And look at Snape, the character of Snape. How do we know what we know about him? Anyway, so I hate to move on from cake. I always enjoy starting my day with a little slice of cake.
Yeah, we'll move from cake to what?
Well, I think the next thing we should probably move to is Amherst College. Right here in Massachusetts.
Not far away.
Amherst College decided this week to drop Lord Jeff, who refers to Lord Geoffrey Amherst, who was the Field Marshal of the British North American forces during the
French and Indian War.
Indian Wars, right? To drop him as their mascot.
I think unofficial mascot?
Unofficial mascot,
Yeah,
that's
that was
right.
their little
That's
bit
what
of
the Board of
wiggle room.
Trustees, right. And largely because while he was renowned as a very effective military commander, one of the things he did advocate was putting smallpox into blankets and passing them out to the Native Americans, right?
It's an early form of
germ warfare. Absolutely. And one letter exists from 1763 where he wrote, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race."
So he's trying to wipe out
the native population. So that's a really interesting question, because there have been a lot of schools that have been struggling with this lately. Right?
Yeah, I mean, actually for the last, say, 10 years anyway.
Exactly.
I mean, North Dakota dropped the name of the Fighting Sioux. Many other schools, a lot of schools named Redmen that have gone to,
UMass,
the University of Massachusetts.
Stanford was an early dropper. They dropped Indians and then became the Cardinal. They don't even have a mascot. They have a tree that runs around with their band. So it's a really interesting question. When I used to teach at Valparaiso University in Indiana, and they are a German Lutheran heritage school, and they used to have the Ulan as their mascot, who is a fierce German warrior. But during World War II decided that wasn't going to fly anymore.
Probably not a good idea.
Probably not a good idea when you're fighting Germany. And so they changed it, but ironically, they changed their mascot to something that at the time was more palatable, which was the Crusader.
Right.
Which, of course, in today's context, raises this question of, does this really represent the values of the institution? So it's a really interesting
It is an interesting
development.
question. The other interesting thing about that story was that it's a good example of student-faculty activism as well, because this was really a grassroots movement by students to remove Lord Jeff, and faculty took a vote on it. And so a decision by the Board of Trustees is the culmination of
a process. A really democratic process. The other thing, though, that's also important, I think, because, we're talking here a little bit about censorship, both the birthday cake book and maybe this question about Lord Jeff. The Board of Trustees was really clear, saying, this is not our official mascot. We will not be using this as an institution.
You can't buy it in the bookstore on T-shirts.
Exactly. But we cannot force other people not to be wearing Lord Jeff stuff or even singing. I suppose there's probably some fight song about Lord Jeff. Yeah. So it's an interesting kind of walking the line between censorship on the one hand and holding on to freedom of speech, right? So I think it's a great move on Amherst part.
Yeah, although I do suspect that in 5 years, 10 years, you'll still be able to buy the Lord Jeff T-shirt.
I bet you there will be a lot of Lord Jeffs walking around Halloween next year.
Yeah, probably
a lot
not
of
the
kids
bookstore,
going as Lord Jeff.
You can buy it online somewhere.
Exactly. Okay, and then the third thing, Edward, we are in a presidential campaign year.
I heard something about that the other day.
Yes, and I want to turn to Hillary Clinton for a minute, Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton. At the debate referenced history. And, it's always so interesting to see how candidates talk about history.
Right.
And they can use the exact same historical moment for very different political ends. She slipped into something here, stepped into a bit of a mess. So
she was asked a question, which was, which president inspires you?
Right. Which president inspires you? And she went to one of the standards for a Democrat, which is Honest Abe, right? And
interestingly, didn't pick her husband. That got a little social media lit for a few minutes, but then what followed that
might have been more than a Freudian slip on her part, frankly. But we really can't speculate. But what followed was this characterization of Lincoln, but not just Lincoln, but of post-Civil War policy that was really problematic. She said she characterized Lincoln as a guy who would forgive and reconcile, gesturing toward this atmosphere of rancor that we currently have.
Had he lived,
it might have looked different.
Right, that Southerners wouldn't have gotten so upset and would have been so defiant. Yeah,
maybe I'll read the quote because it's pretty amazing. She said, "I don't know what our country might have been like had he not been murdered, and I bet that it might have been a little less rancorous, a little more forgiving and tolerant. That might possibly have brought people back together more quickly." So that's okay, maybe, but it's not very accurate when you think about Lincoln's sense of the South versus Johnson was the one who's bringing folks together. But anyway, so not such great history there. And then it gets worse. But instead, she continues, we had Reconstruction, and we had the reinstigation of segregation and Jim Crow. We had people in the South feeling totally discouraged and defiant. So I really do believe he could have very well put us on a different path. So many problems with that, right? I mean, first of all, equating Reconstruction, which is characterized by the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, with segregation. Actually, it's the opposite. The values
those things are intent. One followed the other.
These are not equivalents, right? And also the way she talks about we had people in the South feeling discouraged and defiant. I mean, who are those people? We also had people in the South really delighted about aspects of Reconstruction, i.e. Black Southerners.
And very much, as time went by, people that were very much increasingly under the heel of this resurgent white
these discouraged and defiant folks, I mean, we're redeeming, quote unquote. So it's really sloppy, and you got to ask, why did she go there? I mean, how do you make Reconstruction and Jim Crow equal problems?
Yeah, how do you, in 2016, essentially summarize the plot of The Birth of a Nation? That's probably, this incredibly racist film that came out 101 years ago. And I don't think that's your intention, but it does speak in some ways to how embedded that narrative is in people's minds, and how through popular culture,
there's just mythology from Gone with the Wind to Monuments to what strikes me is this a candidate pandering subtly to white Southerners, or is it just that she herself has absorbed this larger cultural zeitgeist among some white Americans that says, that was a moment of domination by a class of people that didn't have the ability to rule, i.e. emancipated slaves, and so therefore the white South is as victim. I find that to be really distasteful and inaccurate, frankly.
It's really, as historians, it's a really discouraging moment when you hear a very highly educated, sensitive person saying
with good intentions.
Saying this. Like, I think if she had been confronted with a question about the Confederate flag, she would have given a very different answer.
Absolutely.
But in this case, this just sort of came up from her sophomore year high school history class, perhaps. Who knows?
Who knows where it came from?
But it means certainly we can conclude one thing, which is that historians continue to have a lot more work to do.
Right. We need to do better on this question, particularly when there's a conversation among the candidates now where it doesn't seem anybody is calling, any media are calling the candidates on their accuracy. Right? So we clearly have to educate the journalists, too, to respond, the media of the debate, to respond and say, push a little bit further.
That's right. There are the PolitiFact and a few other organizations that will fact check post-debate, mostly economic statistics, job creation stats, things of that nature. But I've not seen anything where they've actually engaged historians to say that historical reference to the First Amendment, is that accurate?
Right.
So
or partial. So an interesting week in history.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us here at In the Past Lane.
My absolute pleasure.
Well, In the Past Lane's senior correspondent, Stephanie Yule, is professor of history at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Mass. You can learn more about her research and her publications at our website, inthepastlane.com. Don't touch that dial.
Well, people, that's going to do it for this week's episode. I hope you found this episode both entertaining and informative. Please let us know what you think about it on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I also recommend that you check out our website, inthepastlane.com, because that's where you'll find a show page for this episode that includes show notes, links, essays, images, and further reading suggestions related to everything we've talked about in this episode. At inthepastlane.com, you can also learn more about our guests, correspondents, and other contributors. And I'd be most grateful if you subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, please leave a starred review and comment. It really helps. Thanks. And don't forget, you can catch Megan Kate Nelson's insightful review and commentary about the latest episode of PBS's Mercy Street in our Mercy Street Rewind feature. To avoid spoilers, Mercy Street Rewind appears as a separate segment in this podcast feed. Many terrific people play a role in bringing you In the Past Lane. They include technical advisors Holly Hunt and Jesse Anderson, podcasting consultant Daryl Darnell of Pro Podcast Solutions, photographer John Buckingham, graphic designer Maggie Salucci, website by ERI Design, legal services Tippa Canoe and Tyler 2, social media management The Pony Express, risk assessment Little Bighorn Associates, and growth strategies 5440 or Fight. And of course, we'd be nowhere without our executive producer Lulu Spencer. Special thanks also to Jay Graham for creating the intro music for this podcast, and to the Free Music Archive for providing the rest of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Lulu, you get the last word. Go.
Why am I even here?
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.